Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be looking at some object source lighting. This is something that's always been really challenging and it can be difficult to wrap your head around, but I wanted to try something different and just kind of experiment. I've done some object source lighting in the past, and so this is less of a definite tutorial and more of an exploration in the technique itself. As you can see in the background, I've started off with a zenithal prime, so this is just a black, and then I'm going for a grey just from above here. I don't want to go too bright off the bat because we are going to be using a lot of different light sources. And so to begin that, I've started off with a white. I'm running all these paints through my airbrush. I figured this would probably be the quickest way, but the principle is the same, the concept is the same, so you could in theory do this with a brush. I'm just trying to save some time and get some decent gradients. At this stage, I've decided that my light source is going to be coming up from underneath, so that's why I'm hitting all these hands and the smoke with the white. And I'm not being shy with the airbrush, I'm really laying on some white as a strong undertone here for my next color. For that, I've decided I'm going to do a red glow, so I've got some fluorescent red and I'm starting to cover up all that white. Now this seems a bit kind of silly to paint it white and then paint it red again, but what I'm hoping that the white is going to do is create a really super saturated fluorescent red underneath. If the red is on the black part of the paint, it's going to look kind of dull and orangey, whereas if it's on the bright white underneath, it's going to look really super saturated red. And I'm also angling my airbrush to hit blade here from underneath as well. I picked this model because I wanted to do something a little different, a little bit more colorful than what I've been doing recently. And also I thought that this would be a really good candidate for some strong object source lighting. So I'm just making sure that I'm covering up all the white sections and very occasionally aiming up above and hitting blade. I don't want to cover up too much, but I want to get some of that glow starting to appear on his body. On the opposite side of the model, I've decided to use a kind of navy blue color, and I'm starting to basically kind of sketch in where I want my colors. I'm not too worried about highlights, I'm not too worried about light sources just yet. I'm just trying to figure out like my two main colors and where on the model they're going to be. The concept in my head for this model is kind of a moonlit blade leaping into a very fiery pit of vampires and demons. And so to achieve that, once the airbrushing is dry, I'm starting to analyze those areas where I can punch up the highlights. I'm not too worried that I kind of oversprayed onto the jacket behind his head or some of the areas on his body, but what I'm looking for at this stage is where I can start to build in those highlights and start to reinforce the idea that he's being lit from underneath. So to start that off, I decided to tackle the red side of blade, and I'm using a very similar red to the fluorescent red. This is obviously a little bit darker and it doesn't look like it's doing much right now, but what I'm hoping to do is start to sketch in those areas where I want those high points in the tints. I'm not looking to overshadow the real brightness of that red, so this is kind of a darker red, and I'm just starting to lay in the idea that some of these areas are going to be a little bit brighter than others. I've mixed in a little bit of black to kind of create almost like a dark red, and I'm using that for these areas that are a little bit more further away from the light source. I'm starting to incorporate the idea that closer to the light is going to be brighter, further away on the model is going to be darker. And really at this stage, I am just kind of guessing, I'm just kind of sketching. There's no real hard and fast rule for this, but there are real life lighting principles and kind of light physics that we can employ on the model to really sell the idea that this is a bright light source. And one of those things is really contrast is what we're looking to do. The light source itself doesn't have to be particularly bright, but if we have a high contrast, so for example, the model is mainly black, but really the brightest point is the light source, it's going to look like it's the brightest thing on the model. So to start increasing these highlights, rather than adding white to the paint, which will make it more of a pink color, I'm adding orange. Now this will give it more of a warmer highlight, and it will look a little bit more like fire, but what this will do is it will kind of keep the saturation of the red, but not feel like it's being diluted into a pink. And so I'm introducing more and more orange and building it up into really more of a neon orange. It's also at this stage that I'm starting to think about material as well. So, for example, I really want all my highlights to be on the shinier material because it would naturally kind of reflect more of that light source. So I'm really focusing my yellow and orangey highlights specifically on materials that would be kind of glossy or shiny. So for example, his chest armor, the jacket, and the knee pads. You can also see that I'm starting to use a pure yellow now, but I'm making sure that I'm doing it smaller and smaller on the model. I don't want to overshadow the previous highlight or overrun the previous color. So these are just the smallest dots of yellow and then mixed with some white to create kind of a moon dusty yellow color. I'm going in and just toning down some more of these highlights. I don't want them to be as shiny and bright, so these are a little bit more on the orangey side of things. Different surfaces and materials are going to reflect red light differently, and to create some more interest on the model, I'm using a pure black here to kind of break up some of these gradients that I've got going on, and also imply that these sections on his armor are made of a different material than the metal. I'm also using this opportunity to go around and just cover up a lot of that overspray from the initial airbrushing. I don't want to cover up too much of the work, but it's nice to kind of be able to have some control on where those highlights and shadows are. I think the red glow is in a pretty good spot right now, so I'm going to switch over to the blue side. So I started off with that same navy blue that I used for the airbrush, but you can see it's a lot more saturated on the model itself. And I started to add some white to it. I just really wasn't happy with this effect, so I will be coming back and revisiting this section. But what I'm trying to achieve is, on the cooler blue side of Blade, he's kind of being moonlit, and then underneath, that's where the main light source is really going to be dominating this model. So you can see I'm just going around adding this kind of powdery baby blue to some of these areas of highlight, some of these ridges on the coat. I just really wasn't happy with this effect, so I let it kind of sit, and I'll come back and revisit this. For right now, it's a great way to kind of see where my highlights are. And like I say, things aren't perfect. You're going to push and pull paint around the model and kind of figure it out as you go along, which is great. Nothing is permanent with painting miniatures, so don't worry if it's not perfect. It's all about experimentation, what looks good, and just kind of getting used to the idea of highlight and contrast rather than color itself. And a great example of that is the inside of his jacket. It's normally a really deep red, but under a blue light, it's going to look much more pink. So this looks kind of strange right now. It's kind of neon and weird, but eventually, once we take a step back from the whole model, it's going to look a little bit more natural because of the other colors surrounding it. It's going to kind of trick the eye. You can see I even changed the pink color to a little bit more of a darker shade of pink because I thought that neon was a little bit too bright. And this is arguably the hardest thing to do in object source lighting, which is to take an everyday natural normal color and then view that color under a completely different colored light source. It changes the color of the original object completely. But that's part of learning about color theory and trying to figure stuff out as you go along. Nobody's perfect, everybody's going to learn and try to figure out things as they go. But this is kind of the fun of it, right? Like, this is kind of where you look at the model and you decide to make kind of bold choices that look really bizarre, but then as a complete, they kind of work, right? Like, as you take a step back, it kind of works. Here I'm going in with a black, and I decided to kind of outline those shadows, wasn't really happy with it, and then I revisited the knees with a kind of a blue-gray, and that really worked. I think toning it down from that navy blue into a much more subtle blue-gray, I think sells it not only as a different fabric to the jacket, but also it just takes that color down a notch. I decided to add a little bit of pink. This isn't really pink, this is kind of like some white, some red, and a tiny amount of orange, but it's much more pinker than the orange highlights. And I'm just doing some really rough sketch highlights on his belt. It's not too dissimilar from the other color, but hopefully it looks different enough so that it feels like a different color or a different material. For his face, I really wanted to push myself and really try to analyze what a face would look like under two strong light sources. So to begin with, I decided to do the hair completely black. Not only is this a defining factor of Blade, but also I wanted to imply the idea that not everything has to reflect light, it can absorb it as well. And I went a little bit wacky with some purple. I don't know if it was kind of working or not, so here I'm just laying in some highlights as if it's coming from the blue light source. And then I decided to mix in some of that navy blue, and I was much more happy with this kind of electric blue color. I'm focusing these highlights towards the top side of the face, or the kind of upper left side of the face where the light source is, and then underneath I'm focusing on some red highlights like I did with the jacket and the body armor. I decided to get his lenses for his sunglasses in a white first. Really taking my time, making sure I'm not going to overspill on any of the parts of the face. And then I went back in with that fluorescent red and just did a very quick coat on top of that. Again, I'm still thinking of materials, so I want these to be really super saturated red. I think it makes a really nice, stunning comic book idea, as well as like the only thing you can see is his sunglasses. And then I added just a dot of white for a highlight at the very bottom of those lenses. After a lot of back and forth, I decided to re-edit the light source itself. I felt like I really like how really bright red and saturated the kind of smoky part of the base is, but it didn't really match color-wise to what's being reflected on the model. So I decided to revisit this and kind of repaint some of this to match. I started off by using some white and just kind of feathering it to the very base of the smoke, at the kind of the cuffs of the hands here, and then dry brushing on some black to kind of imply that these demons or these vampires are becoming corporeal as they emerge from the smoke. I'm really just messing around at this point. I'm just kind of figuring out what areas need work, where I need to revisit. So right here I'm looking at the cape, I need to revisit the cape, I need to revisit the smoke again. But at the end of the first evening, this is kind of where I'm at, and I decided to take a break. I wanted to step away, kind of revisit it in the morning, and look at it with fresh eyes. I highly encourage anybody who's suffering from kind of painter's block or lack of inspiration to do that. It really does help to kind of come at it again another day and look at the model and decide where you want to improve. So here I'm going back in with the fluorescent red. I'm hoping that the white is enough to kind of rebalance and add some interest. It wasn't, I ended up covering it up anyway. by taking that break and coming back and looking at the model, I've figured out where I need to add some more interesting color. So I've decided to tone down the overall glow with some black. For this, I think this was actually a black ink, which just runs really nicely through the airbrush. And I'm starting to lay in, not necessarily texture, but more just sort of shadows, I guess. This is also a great opportunity to revisit the overcoat and add some deeper shadows to that. So very carefully running a line of that black down the crease, the overcoat. And I decided to run this all the way around the back as well, so that it looks like the lower section of his coat is in shadow as well. What this is doing is it's reintroducing those lights and shadows and kind of bringing that balance back to the main light source, which is what I wanted. So here I'm trying out an orange, building up those same highlights like I did on the boots and the jacket from the underneath. So I'm using oranges and yellows, just mixing them in the airbrush and just doing a quick blast to kind of see how I feel about it and how bright it looks compared to the rest of the model. And so I found myself back in the experimental phase of the miniature painting. I'm just kind of trying different colors through the airbrush to hopefully build up that brightness that I'm really looking for. There are many other YouTubers that understand this down to a science and have done this for years, but for me, it's more about learning by doing. So I'm just trying stuff. I'm just trying different brightnesses, trying different saturations to help not only match the color of the highlight underneath, but also feel like more of a natural light source. The one tip that I've always known about, or I've picked up on over the years by doing this, is the reflected light on the subject is never going to be brighter than the light source itself. So I'm making sure that ultimately whatever I decide on is always still going to be the brightest point is the light itself, or where the light is coming from. I want to make sure that even though I've got some yellow and white highlights on Blade, that those still aren't as bright as where the light is coming from. So once I've finally decided on where I want those highlights, I'm going back in with some pure white and really punching those highlights on the light source at the base. And now it's really just come down to the idea of kind of reinforcing some of those oranges, those colors. I'm still not 100% happy with the way the glow came out, but for now I think it sells the idea that this is really being lit from underneath. For the katanas, I'm taking a different approach. This is another thing that I've kind of developed over the years, is actually tinting the model rather than painting in those highlights in the color. So to do that, I'm laying down a really rough gradient from white to medium gray, maybe some dark gray in there. But I'm just mixing up a quick grayscale gradient and doing some very kind of not very smooth gradients on the blades themselves. And then I'm making sure that I get a nice edge highlight to kind of blend. The eye kind of blends those transitions when there's an overarching highlight. This is a completely different approach to object source lighting. And so by using that fluorescent red in a very thin coat, I can now tint that grayscale. And just like we did with the zenithal highlight, you can see that the red is inheriting whatever the tone was underneath. So if it was a dark gray, it's a dark red, a light gray, it's a light red. And this is a completely valid approach to the model itself. I could have, in theory, painted Blade in grayscale and then just tinted the whole model red and blue. I wanted to see if I could paint the whole model in those kind of red scales and blue scales rather than doing it in grayscale and then tinting it. And then I'm finishing out those blades with some more white to kind of bring the highlight back into the katana. I'm repeating this exact same process on the other side of the blade, but this time I'm going to be tinting it blue. And that's because really these blades are kind of the dividing point on the model. I decided that this is where the light source is switching and the angle of these katana blades is really a nice divide between the blue and the red. I've watered down some blue and I'm just kind of tinting the blades blue. I'm not going too crazy, I don't want it to look like really bright, so this is just a single coat. But I'm really happy with the idea that this is selling as not only a shiny metal, but also a difference in warm and cool colors. I'm just adding a couple quick highlights on the sheaths. This is just to kind of draw the eye to some of these areas that may have been lost. So for example, the dagger, you can't really see it right now, but I'm just adding some highlights. It doesn't have to make sense. There would be no light that would hit these katana blades at this angle, but I'm just adding some highlights just to kind of draw the eye. I like to finish out all my models with a black rim, and this helps to kind of hide some of that overspill. And then I decided one final touch was to add some ash grey on the fingertips. And there we have it, some real deep dive into object source lighting. This was a really fun experiment. I was able to really push myself a lot more than what I normally would do. And I think it's really beneficial to sometimes just paint something that you're not used to, paint something that you don't necessarily need for your army, but you want to learn something new or you want to try a technique. And I've got a ton of these kind of models that are just either one-offs or from games that I don't play, and I just want to try stuff on them, you know, experiment and try different techniques, or in the case of this one, push the concept of object source lighting to the next level. As always, I would love to know what you guys think. I know that object source lighting is really difficult for a lot of beginner painters or even intermediate and expert painters. So please let me know down in the comments below your previous experiences, or if it's something that you're trying to get better in. And also, if you like this style of video, is this something that you'd like to see more of, these kind of technique videos rather than the painting tutorial videos? As always, a very, very gracious thank you to my YouTube members. Feel free to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to see content beyond the channel, there's also my Patreon, which has a whole bunch of extra content. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.